My neighbors that live across the street often travel. I'm 23 years old, and I share a duplex with a guy about 10 years older than me, who lets me rent it out for a really low price every month. He was super understanding of my financial situation from the day we first met, and we became friends pretty quickly. I'm currently enrolled in school, and don't have a lot of money. I've often chatted with neighbors who live across the street and became good friends with them as well. One day, they asked me if I would be interested in house sitting while they were gone. They offered me $400 for the week to occasionally check in on the house and make sure their cat had enough food and water. It was an extremely generous offer, and I accepted it since I really needed the money. They left on a Sunday and would be returning the following Sunday. Before leaving, they also asked me to hang out there for a couple hours at night with the lights on each night so that people thought they were home. The week before they left, they installed a Ring doorbell camera at their front door so they could always see if someone was at their door. They signed me into their account so that I would have access to the camera and doorbell for the week. Once they left Sunday, I headed over there later that night to check on the cat and watch TV with the lights on in the living room. It was a super easy job, and I was very thankful that they were generously paying me for the task. The first 3 nights went by super easily, and there were no problems. On Wednesday night, that's when it all changed. I had finished hanging out at the house for the night, and went back inside across the street to my house. Shortly after getting back, I got a notification that someone was at their front door. I looked out the window and saw a silhouette of a person wearing all black standing in front of their porch. It was around 10 p.m. or so it seemed suspicious that someone would be there so late. I waited for the notification to see if the person would ring the doorbell, but they never did. They just stood there. I opened up the app to get a better look at the person and saw a masked man standing completely motionless staring at their front door. I instantly spoke into the microphone, trying to disguise my voice as the owner, saying, "Can I help you?" He seemed a little surprised when he saw the camera, and he whispered saying he was in trouble and needed a phone. I replied saying no and that he needed to leave. He seemed really strange, and I didn't want to risk the house getting burglarized for the 3rd time this year. I continued to watch him on the camera as he just stood there, not saying anything. Another minute went by, until I came over the microphone again and said, "Please leave or I'll have to call the cops." Right around the exact time I said that, I received a text from the homeowner who was also watching the feed and listening to the conversation. He told me that there was a good chance that guy was the burglar who had broken in multiple times, and he was calling the cops. I continued to watch through the camera and look out the window simultaneously as the man finally stepped back from the porch and started walking down their driveway. I watched the man cross the street, heading directly towards the duplex I was staying in. I started freaking out and grabbed the baseball bat that I slept with next to my bed. He started walking up my driveway, and I felt sheer panic as he walked directly towards the door to my house, becoming more terrified with each step he took. I ran downstairs to the main floor to make sure I locked the door, which I was glad to see I did. Suddenly, I heard what sounded to be a set of keys jingling as I watched the lock turn over. I ran to the other side of the room and hid in the closet as the masked man entered the house. I couldn't believe it. How could he have keys to the house? Without him seeing me, I watched as he removed the mask and put it into his pocket. My heart sunk. It was the owner of the duplex. So many thoughts raced through my head. I couldn't believe it was him. I stayed hidden until he walked into the other room as I quietly crept back upstairs to my room. The police eventually arrived across the street. They never found out who was there. I moved out a couple months later once I had the money, and I've never told a soul to this day. I live on my own in a small house just outside Chicago. My neighborhood is pretty quiet, and a lot of my neighbors are older and retired. For my birthday, my parents bought me a Ring doorbell camera because they've always been worried about my safety, since I'm a woman who lives by myself. After installing it, I played around with the app which connects to my phone, so that I'd get notifications on my phone if someone was at the door. I've never had any issues with anybody in the area, and felt pretty comfortable most of the time. That all changed on a cold, rainy night in the fall when I had a horrifying experience. It was Friday night. I finished up my last shift of work for the week and came home looking forward to the weekend where I'd be able to relax and catch up on sleep. I work as a police dispatcher, so my job is pretty exhausting since I'm constantly receiving emergency calls and relaying the information over to the police. After getting home, I did some laundry and cooked dinner while I spent time with my 5-year-old black lab. A couple hours after I had dinner, I made some popcorn and sat down on the couch and watched a movie in the living room with my dog right next to me, who was pretty clingy. About an hour or so into the movie, my dog jumped off the couch and walked up to the window facing the driveway. It didn't really concern me, since he always heard noises and would look out the window. After maybe 30 seconds of standing there, he started growling and making his usual crying noises. He's an extremely friendly dog, but he likes to try to sound like a guard dog whenever he sees someone outside. I was expecting an Amazon delivery that night, so I just assumed he was growling at the delivery driver. A couple seconds later, I received the notification on my phone that there was motion detected at the door. Out of curiosity, I opened up the app to see the live feed. My relaxed mood instantly changed when I saw 2 police officers walking up to the front door. I watched the feed, and I listened as they whispered to each other words I couldn't make out. At this point, I was definitely concerned and wondered why the police would be at my door. I watched as the one officer rang my doorbell, which made my dog start barking like crazy. I got up and stood in the kitchen, using the app to talk to them. I said, "Hi, how can I help you guys?" The officer responded saying, "Good evening, ma'am. We received a couple domestic violence reports from your neighbors. We just need to come in and make sure you're not in danger and that everything is alright." My mind raced as I tried to figure out why my neighbors would be calling the police to my house. They know I live alone. My only thought was that they had the wrong address. I responded saying, "Are you sure you guys have the right address? I live alone here. It's just me." Right when I said that, I instantly regretted saying that as I started to doubt their legitimacy of actually being real police officers. The other man, who had stayed silent the whole time, replied saying, "Yes, ma'am. We were called to this address and need to make sure that you're not in any sort of danger." I immediately responded saying, "Do you guys mind if I see your badge numbers?" And they both said sure as they held up their numbers. From my experience in my work field, I know for a fact that badge numbers should be accompanied by their photo ID, and that's when I asked, "Can I see your photo ID?" I knew this would verify their legitimacy since it should have a signature below it from the chief of police. They both looked at each other, hesitantly, and said something like, "Oh, we left that in the cruiser. It'll only be a couple minutes if the call we received was inaccurate. We won't take up too much of your time." That response instantly freaked me out since it confirmed my suspicions that they weren't real officers. I didn't respond and ran upstairs to my room and locked myself inside with my dog. I called 911 and recognized the voice of my coworker. I told him who I was, and I asked if he could check to see if there was a call to my house for a domestic dispute. I waited for a minute or so, and he came back to the phone telling me no and asked why. I explained my situation to him, and he seemed just as freaked out as I was, and told me he'd have any available units in the area sent over immediately. I thanked him, and almost jumped out of my skin when I heard the loud banging on my front door. The one guy was yelling, "Police, open up." He kept repeating it as he pounded on my front door. This continued as I stayed on the phone with dispatch, filling him in on what was going on. The one man outside started shouting, saying that they're coming in if I don't open up. At this point, my heart was beating out of my chest. I had no way of defending myself except for my dog, which I'm assuming didn't scare them. I watched on the feed as they both started kicking the door. Another minute passed by as I heard the sound of police sirens in the distance, which grew louder with every second. I watched as they both fled from my doorstep, running down my driveway towards the sidewalk. I looked out the window to see them get into a maroon sedan and take off, just before the police arrived. Once the real police showed up, I explained everything that happened and sent them the footage from my doorbell camera. For some reason, they were never able to identify the men at my door. I'm glad that I work in the field that I do, which helped me detect their fraudulent identification. I'll never know what would have happened if I had opened that door, and I'm thankful I'll never have to find out. I recently moved into a new home in a pretty nice neighborhood with my 10-year-old son. I'm a single father, so I'm the only one who looks after my son. I've had to send him to daycare most of his childhood, since I obviously didn't want to leave him at home by himself. Ever since he turned 9, he started asking me if he could take the bus home after school instead of waiting in aftercare. I always told him that it wasn't safe to be on his own, especially since our neighbor at the end of our street had his house broken into a couple months ago. When his 10th birthday was coming up, he told me that all he wanted was to be allowed to take the bus home, since according to him, he was the oldest kid in aftercare and would always be bored. I wasn't a huge fan of the idea, but I deeply considered it. His school let out at 2:30, meaning he'd be home alone for about 2.5 to 3 hours a day. I ended up caving into his wish, and I told him on his 10th birthday that he'd be allowed to take the bus home after school, under the condition that he'd always lock the door and do his homework before playing video games. He promised, and we made the agreement. He was a smart kid for his age, and knew not to answer the door when he was on his own. Fast forward a couple months, I was proud of him for consistently following my instructions and getting his homework done right away. I decided to install a Ring doorbell camera so that I could always monitor the front door, especially in the few hours a day he'd be on his own. One day, after he got home, I got the notification on my phone that there was motion detected at the front door, and I opened the app to see him walk inside and close the door behind him. I always checked this because I wanted to make sure he made it inside safe. I set my phone down and went back to work until I got another notification maybe 15 to 20 minutes later that there was motion detected at the front door. This obviously concerned me since I wasn't expecting any packages or guests, so I opened the app to see who it was. I watched as a man dressed in super baggy shorts and stood at the door after ringing the doorbell. My heart sunk as I hoped my son wouldn't answer the door. I remembered that I could use my phone through the camera to talk to the man, so I said, "Can I help you?" And the man replied saying, "Hi, I lost my dog and I think he ran into your backyard. Can I go look?" I've never seen this guy before in the neighborhood, so I responded saying, "I just looked in my backyard. He's not there," trying to make it sound like I was home. For some reason, the guy insisted that his dog was in the backyard and started to walk around the back. My heart raced as I thought about my son who would sometimes do homework in the treehouse I built him a few years back. Our backyard was fenced in, but it was easily accessible. I yelled into my phone telling the guy to leave now or I'm calling the cops, but I watched as he continued to ignore me and headed down the walkway towards the backyard. My coworker who was next to me witnessed the entire situation, and I told him to call the cops for me right away. He dialed 911 while I called the home phone at my house to warn my son. He didn't answer and it went straight to voicemail. Instead of hanging up, I kept telling him to lock the back door as soon as possible, since the voicemail would be played out loud on the phone. I was literally shaking, and I drove home as fast as I could. I pulled into the house and sprinted to the backyard to see that the fence gate was wide open. I ran inside to see that the back door was also open, and I screamed for my son, but there was no response. I ran into the backyard and called his name, and I felt a huge sense of relief as I heard him reply from his treehouse. I told him to stay up there as I waited in the back for the cops to arrive. Once they showed up, I explained what happened and they searched the house, only to find out it was vacant. They found clear signs of forced entry to the back door and also discovered a smudged fingerprint on the door handle, which must have been wiped off. I showed them the Ring doorbell footage and they began an investigation, but never found out who it was. It still remains a mystery to this day.